And now, from beyond our dimension, this is the JeffMara podcast. Here's Jeff.
My guest is Gary Wayne, best-selling author of the books The Genesis 6 Conspiracy, Parts 1 and 2. He is a Christian contrarian who has maintained a lifelong love affair with biblical prophecy, history, and mythology. Gary, thanks for joining me and welcome.
Well, thank you for inviting me to your show, and so happy to be here and very much looking forward to introducing myself to your audience and to hopefully some topics that they're going to find interesting and maybe raise a few eyebrows about and maybe want to dig a little bit more deeply into after the show.
Well, we're excited to have you. You call yourself a Christian contrarian. Is that similar to being a Christian conspiracy theorist?
No, I would distinguish them, but one might lead to the other. So my understanding is how I come about calling myself a contrarian is that I'm a Christian contrarian, but it's by my nature, I'm contrarian. I like to verify things for myself. I do not like to accept what somebody says, what something says, that's heard that they said that somebody saw.
Yeah.
I want to be able to dig my teeth into it because I want to be able to back up what I'm saying. I mean, the worst thing you can sort of do, at least for me, my personality type is to go on and on and on about something that I thought was true because I was relying on what somebody told me, and turns out it's totally wrong. It's like I just feel like, well, boy, how many people did I mislead? So, and I like to know why I believe what I believe. So I want to be able to communicate that. So whether it's in the Bible or outside the Bible, I want to verify it myself and go right to the sources and have those sources in case I need to supply a little bit more information to people on that, because some of the topics I talk about gets thrown into the conspiracy theory, but it's actual history.
Mm-hmm.
And so as you're talking about things and explaining things, whether it's in prehistory, history, or in the future, you can get labeled and part of the genre of the conspiracy theory, but not in the way that we've come to connotate conspiracy theories today. But here's a set of facts that's indicating this sort of outcome is what a theory is all about, right? So it's like a hypothesis based on the research that you've done. So when I research anything that's outside the Bible, I measure it against what's inside the Bible. And if I'm going to use it in my research and it's different, I'll distinguish that so that people know, oh, this is the other sort of testimony to that event, subject, doctrine, whatever. But, it's not necessarily aligning up with what the Bible says. And it's fine. People should be able to agree and disagree respectfully, as long as the sourcing is there, and then you can kind of decide. So I like to be very, very detailed in the research that I do, and I can go deeper than most people on most subjects.
Well, it almost sounds like you're a Christian skeptic.
Well, I've become at odds with a lot of Christian doctrine because people accept what people say in Christianity, and it differs from what the Bible would say. And that's where how I come about being a contrarian puts me in that standing against the standard dogma, whether it's Christian or secular history or, just uncountable other items. So I tend to get comfortable if I'm swimming upstream because I might be onto something.
Well, how has your research changed your religious beliefs over the years?
Well, it's a really good point, because when I sort of got into what I'm doing, I was a real history buff and a mythology buff when I was young, and I read everything I could get my hands on. But I took a challenge when I was about 20 or 21 to read a specific book. And people in the audience may not be aware of it, but he was a prolific writer in the 60s, 70s, and 80s on end time prophecy. And I was not a Christian at the time, and I was not familiar with his work, and I was not familiar with the Bible. But I read the book, and it scared the socks off of me that even if 10% of it was true, I needed to know more about this. So that set me on my sort of quest to research the Bible to verify is he being accurate or is he distorting the Bible? And for the most part, I thought he was reasonably accurate on what he was doing, and so then I needed to know more about that. And then as I was logging all of those different prophecy narratives, I started running into things that were sort of giving me cognizant dissonance in my brain and almost making it explode. Um, Particularly with some super preternatural things that we just don't want to sort of look at. And the Bible is likely the most preternatural book ever written, and yet Christianity tries to dumb it down as opposed to just saying, hey, let's go with this. It's what it says. Let's go with it. Let's not try and rewrite what it says. Things like giants. And when I got to Genesis 6 in giants, I said, whatever this is, I don't want anything to do with it. That's crazy stuff. That's bizarro world. I don't want anything to do with it. But the research, you're going through the Bible, all this thing sort of keeps coming up. And so at some point in time, I decided, well, while I'm doing this research, I am going to log it into files as what I was doing with all of the prophecy narratives. And I accumulated a lot of passages, not all of them, because you don't recognize all the passages that are talking about those particular items in the book. But a couple of things about it is that I started to understand that aspect of the Bible gives you like a Rosetta Stone for what's going on into the Bible right through to end time prophecy. And with my reading of secular history, as recorded by historians versus polytheist history, more by the religious and cultural aspect as it comes down throughout the history, I understood that these characters and giants and other beings were a global testimony. They're on all continents, all around the world, even likely Antarctica. And even though we don't know what's there yet, we'll probably find something based on the MO sort of finding this everywhere, along with things like the flood story, along with things like the pyramids, things that are inexplicably located in all cultures, all religions, on all continents around the world, and probably likely Antarctica, and no explanation for that, and defies the odds of math and logistics that would be the case based on how history has been taught to us. So I understood that if they're talking about the same events in prehistory and history, and they seem to have a similar outcome in terms of the future, just nuanced, then there's a common history here that Christians need to know, and probably seculars and polytheists would know, because we get into these tribal camps of those belief systems, and we never look at other than we tend to look at more of the belief system where it comes from than the actual events and the details of those accounts. And so that's what I did. I decided I would try and write a book that was about prophecy, how giants are related to the end time, and then bring in the worldwide testimonies to show people that this has been with us. It's part of our raison d'etre. To understand why we're here and where we're going, we need to understand this, because in both and in all, and even in secular adages, let's just use with slightly different terms, nothing is new under the sun. What was will be again. Yeah. And in biblically, there's a little bit of a nuance on the end of that says, and the understanding of this wisdom only brings grief and sorrow.
It's my understanding that you write about bloodlines and secret societies.
Yeah.
Do you ever feel fear writing about these secret societies and bloodlines and potentially exposing them?
Yes, absolutely, because also have been taken throughout their history, in our history, about the secrets that are not to be in the public domain. And that comes upon the punishment of death. And of course, a lot of people will say, well, they don't do that anymore. Not necessarily true, not to the same degree, but also there's a lot of people who go missing that are always unaccounted for. So just to leave that sort of crack open and to verify that, there's a fellow that hopefully I'll be doing a couple shows with here in October and December, but he's gone back underground. And he comes out of the Reynolds family, of North America,
Well, that's my
Nathan
last
Reynolds.
name. Uh-oh.
Yeah. And he read my first book, and that gave him the courage to leave the bloodline. And he couldn't believe the things I was writing about, that I was actually permitted to do that, because they live in fear of death, of leaking privileged information. And he said, even book 2, he says, you even need deeper into the files. He says, I'd love to know how you got those writings that were never designed to leave certain, and there's very few libraries um, that are out there that hold this kind of information. And so he actually did leave, and then he went underground because he was in fear of his life. And then when he thought it was fine, he came back out and seemed to be okay. He actually does a YouTube show right now, and apparently, from what I've heard, he's had to go back underground because he's being hunted again. So within the families, there's a very strong discipline. And if you're going to go against the hegemony, the world hegemony, because they run this world, then expect a significant reaction, unless what you're doing is what you've been assigned to do, which isn't my case, or that from the timetable that they're working with on their agenda, they don't mind that this information is getting out there, and it's more maybe as helpful to their cause as it might be to helpful for other people to understand, but it's not going to hurt their agenda. So Nathan sort of thought the only reason why I was getting away with it was because at this point in time, they're okay with some of this information coming out. So, but I have to tell you, in the beginning, and I put a lot of security in place. I keep a lot of security and space in place because of the risks, is that it was very uncomfortable in terms of everything that was sort of going on within my business in terms of attacks and threats coming in, social media, emails, all sorts of things and it's not, and I wasn't even sort of well known at that point in time, and my book was just starting to take hold, but it was this instant sort of pushback, and I had to change my website to use a high security system through a particular company that I use in the US, because I couldn't keep my website up. It was attacked consistently, and the largest bank in Canada, which I did it with, kept increasing the security. They could not match what was going on. They just said, we can't secure your website.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
Even though the Abrahamic religions are considered monotheistic,
Yeah.
would it be correct to say that the Old Testament is really a polytheistic book?
No, I would not frame it that sort of way. What I would say is that it talks about other pantheons in the Old Testament, like the Baalim Council. You have Sumerian gods in there, like Nergal, for example, and Nebaz. But it is a monotheist document from a Christian and Judaic and Islamic perspective. And so there's another version of the Old Testament that's been drafted in by polytheist sects like the Sabians, like the Essenes, like the Kabbalists, like the Gnostics, where they have their own version of the Old Testament, so to speak, or they take certain aspects of it and put it into their religion. And most of those religions that'll do that, they're actually trying to reunite the ancient religion that they believe was the source religion that was before the flood, that crossed the flood. People might know it if they're into some history, called Zoroastrianism. And it's the religion of Atlantis. It's the religion of the giants. It's the religion both before and after the flood. I call it Enochian mysticism, after Enoch, son of Cain, versus Enoch, son of Jared in the Bible. There's two Cains. And in the Gnostic secret society Masonic tradition, Enoch, son of Cain, is the one who takes the knowledge from Adam to create the 7 sacred sciences that we would know as the 7 liberal arts today. And that's going to be the knowledge that's going to merge with the gods. And this knowledge, Enoch is going to create the antediluvian. And when I say that word for people not familiar with the term pre-flood, versus post-Diluvian after the flood, is the religion that is going to be the initiatory sun-worshipping bull cult. That was a standard religion all around the antediluvian world without explanation. Just different vernacular names for the same gods all around the world. And they did this to house this knowledge. And so when we look at this ancient, this religion of Gnosticism or Zoroastrianism, they have a different history. And in the secret societies and the bloodlines, they call this the Polychronicon. And it was a oral tradition of this history that uses large chunks of the Old Testament as part of its history, but has a polytheist interpretive lens to it that the polytheist religions utilize. It's an interpretive religion versus a literal religion. So for Christians that are out there, if you're seeing an interpretive approach applied to Christianity, then what that's telling you is being seen through a polytheist lens versus a monotheist lens.
I think some of my guests have talked about that there were multiple gods in the Old Testament, and Yahweh ended up being the local god of the area.
Yeah, so that's the interpretive sort of lens to it. So, and it begins that there's a tripart nature, right? So when we look at monotheism from a monotheist perspective, there's one God, but there's also the Spirit of God as a branch, as an extension, and there's the Word of God. So when we look at Lord God as it shows up in the King James Bible, that is Yahweh or Jehovah and Elohim. So Jehovah is the Word of God that we understand as the Word of God in the New Testament, or the word logos of the God Theos. And this is the one, when God speaks, that's the Word. So in Genesis 1, when God said, Hebrew Amar, is Word, and he's introduced to us formally as Jehovah of the Elohim, just as the Spirit of God is in Genesis 1:2 as the Spirit of God, or the Ruach of the Elohim. And Elohim it's plural for the word for an angel or a god, El, and with the I am male plural, Elohim, and it can mean multiple angels or multiple gods in the plural, and El is in the singular, is an individual god or angel. And it can also mean, in the superlative sense, the Trinity as it's applied in the original Hebrew, all three of them at the same time working together. Or it can mean an individual, as in the Father, Abba, as Jesus called him, as the singular nature representing his superior level of being, so to speak. And so you have the Spirit of God working in harmony, and you also have the Word of God working in harmony. So we need to understand that in monotheism, the one God aspect is that Trinity. And it's spoken about in not only in the Old Testament, the New Testament, and in the Qur'an.
Well, the Nephilim are the product of the sons of God, or angels, with human women, right?
Yes.
How do you define angels, and could they be considered extraterrestrials?
Well, by definition, they are extraterrestrial because they're not native to the Earth. So from even a polytheist perspective and a monotheist perspective, the Earth is created by the God of the Bible or the pantheon of the gods, right? And they are not of this world that was created. The angels or the gods are created elsewhere in their heaven, whether it's in Hades or Sheol in polytheism, or in the heaven of the Bible. And so they come from another dimension, from another world. They are spirit beings who have the ability to take a physical form in the physical world, and something that is called an oikaterion, or a dwelling place for the spirit, which is the soul and the body of the physical world, that spirit would merge into the soul so that they could interact physically in the world. They can be here as a spirit realm, but to eat, touch, drink, have sex, you have to have a physical body, right? And that's how you would pass on the DNA. So angels are aliens by definition, and a different kind of being, a different kind of spirit is in the angels that comes from the spirit of God than what is in humans, which is distinct from the animal spirits.
Well, if you look at the comments of some of my videos sometimes, some people will say that ETs are demons. Can
Yeah.
these beings be both angels and demons?
Yes. But be careful with the word demon, because it has a specific sort of meaning, and it comes from the Greek daemon, which are these spirit beings. But these are not angelic spirits. Some people conflate demons with angels as being evil angels, or in polytheism, where you have good gods and evil gods, that demons would be the evil gods in that sort of understanding. So demons are a lower grade of God, if you want to look at it that way. An offspring, but not an offspring God, an offspring demigod, as it was understood in ancientology. And a demigod is defined as, in the polytheist cultures, as the offspring of a god and a human female, or a goddess and a human male. So, for example, Gilgamesh will be produced by Ninsun, a fertility bull goddess in Sumeria, and King Lugalbanda, king of Uruk. So you have now a female goddess and a male, as versus the Christian perspective that a lot of Christians would say, well, we only get accounts of male gods mating with females, creating giants, so that's the only way. But the polytheist cultures have both. So we need to be aware that it's done by whichever gender that God or angel decided to pick, right? And it's, again, so just if we get into the detail and look at the commonalities, things sort of start to explain themselves. So when we look at the accounts in polytheism, you have other accounts that are identical to the sons of God going to the daughters of females or daughters of men in Genesis 6:1-4 to create the Nephilim or giant. And another classic example that people might be familiar with is Zeus. And he mates with Alcmene after the flood. He's an offspring god who rules after the flood. And he produces Hercules through that union. And that produces a Herculean bloodline of Gyges kings that rules in Assyria, rules in Asia Minor, southern Greece, and northern Greece. And so that was called a demigod. Atlas of the Greek mythology and history is the son of Poseidon, an offspring god, probably inherited the mythos of Iapetus, a parent god before the flood. Parent gods ruled before the flood. Offspring gods rule after the flood, and it helps you understand prehistory if you understand when, because it's the same story in all cultures around the world. And inexplicably, you have the parent gods being overthrown and killed by the offspring gods, and that's their sort of allegorical understanding of why an immortal is dead. I won't go into the details of how they deal with that, but understand that the Poseidon was going to mate with Cleito to produce 10 demigod kings for the Atlantean Empire.
Let me stop you for one moment because I want to kind of sort things out in my own mind. The Nephilim were created by sons of God or angels. And then we're talking about all these other gods like Zeus and Poseidon. Yep. Are those gods the same as the sons of God that created the Nephilim?
Yes.
All right. What are some of the most common misunderstandings about the Nephilim?
Generally, how people try and rationalize this concept of giants is that they come from humans. And they may have been 6 feet tall versus 5 feet tall at the time, or whatever sort of separation that they would do on that. And that it is not a separate race. It's just the ones who become the kings set up a mythos to make them superior to justify why they have the divine right to rule. And so even in Christianity, people will say that. Understanding giants in the Bible is not standard dogma in how Christianity is taught. And so people will say, well, the sons of God aren't humans. They, as it's referred to there, but there's no real scripture for that. And then, but what they try and do is they try and say, well, things like uh, terms like the sons of God are used for Christians in the New Testament. Well, that's a prophecy yet to be fulfilled. After we're resurrected, even though we have human fathers, note that even though we have human fathers versus angelic fathers, we'll be adopted as sons of God to be like angels. So we're distinct. Some people will say, well, the sons of God refers to the Sethites. Well, if you're human, you can't produce something that is bigger and stronger, and giants were huge. They're monsters. So that doesn't stand up for it. And then they say, well, sons of God refers to Israel allegorically. And now we're going to use that sort of um, um, literally, except that that comes in prophecies for the end time in the second Exodus. So it's something yet to be fulfilled, which we're talking about something that happened before the flood. Sons of God is used in the Old Testament for angels. Job 1, 6, 2, 1, 34, 38, 4 through 7, at the time of creation in that last one, when humans weren't even created. They're celebrating. And also they're called the sons of the God Most High, El Elyon, another description for Elohim. And they're called gods. They're using the same Hebrew words. And this is the council of the gods that rule this world, that Satan rules over from a biblical sort of perspective, just as God rules over the council in heaven. So you have this sort of rationalization, but you can't match it up with Scripture, and it's out of place and creates conflicts with Scripture. So as the further you sort of dig into it, the more misconstrued it gets. The other concept is that giants were good. Well, some might have been good, but most were evil. And most accounts will say, even if they started off as good, and particularly whether it's Sumerian and Greek, where I'm going to pull these accounts from, and particularly Critias and Timaeus, who wrote about Atlantis, which is, again, the Genesis story, destroyed by catastrophes within a flood story. And you're going to have these giants who are not only rebelling and destroying humankind, but they're rebelling against the gods or the God of the Bible or both. And so some may have been good, like Hercules. He was killing a lot of evil giants, right? But that's kind of polytheist dualism. They have macro dualism and micro dualism. So you have white magic, black magic, white hats, black hats, good kings, evil kings. You get the concept that is perpetually at play within their culture, but outside in the larger war, you have this perpetual war with polytheism where you have Satan as we would understand him, or Lucifer as the Freemasons will call him, as perpetually at war with the God of the Bible, and they're equal. So it never ends, right? It just continues forever. So it's just, again, it's usually the lens that you're looking for it as how you're going to try and interpret it as opposed to let it read. If you were reading from a story, let's say out of Hesiod about giants, well, you might have some basis for saying you have to understand that's not all history. There's a narrative that's being written around names, events, characters, but you can't use it all as perfect history. I get that. That's a style, and we know it today as mythopoetic. That was done by Lewis and Tolkien and other people of the Inkling Society and other styles of writing as it comes down through history to hold that history, right? I get that, but that's an interpretive approach. The Bible and monotheism is a literalist approach. So I give more license to the polytheists in trying to apply their approach to the Bible than Christians that are using not a Christian sort of approach. And for a Christian, I think we should look at things literally, because if it's an interpretive approach, you don't know what the real meaning is, and it could have so many meanings. And according to polytheism, you'd have to be an adept to understand what the real meaning is. And if you're not, then you're just getting fed mundane pablum because you're not worthy enough to know.
Isn't it according to the book of Enoch, the great flood was to destroy all the Nephilim?
Well, yeah, it was. From a perspective of a Christian God, he is Alpha and Omega. He knows the beginning from the end, but he also let things plays out with free will, free choice. So he knows if he brings the flood, angels are going to be involved in helping their offspring because he knows the beginning from the end. So this isn't designed to totally wipe the giants from the face of the earth off. That is part of the benefit for the larger idea that's going to happen here. So there's a term in the Bible that talks about the book of life that's written from before creation. And that everybody whose name was written in that book will have a chance to leave it in or have it blotted out. And that's the time frame where things will continue to happen until that is completed. So let me interject one other sort of thought that helps to understand what's going on with the flood story in the book of Enoch. And it talks about this knowledge that is being passed on from the fallen angels to the humans. And this is angelic technology. And so when we look at the end time like being the days of Noah, we're just catching up to that knowledge that was before the flood. This had planet destruction capability with fire. And so the flood is designed to be more of an intercession. And that the violence with the angelic technology could destroy the world by fire. So God either brings the flood or permits the gods to bring the flood because the polytheist accounts they bring the flood, not God of the Bible. They're taking credit for it. And I don't care which, the flood comes. And so what happens with this knowledge is intricate to understanding the nuance here. So in the Polychronicon in the history of Freemasons, which are the Royals in the Masonic orders as you go higher up in the hierarchy to get to the more pure blood of the Royals, they have a history where they didn't want this knowledge to be lost. And so they took measures to preserve it. And they hid it, according to the Gnostics version, under the Great Pyramid, which is some interesting stuff going on there these days on
definitely.
what supposedly they're finding. And so they decided that because they didn't know whether the catastrophe was going to be fire or flood, they created two pillars called the Pillars of Lamech and Pillars of Enoch, and they have both of those accounts. Both are of the lineage of Cain and of the lineage of Seth. So again, you got to get into the details to know which characters are being talked about in each of the accounts, polytheism or monotheism. And they hid the directions on, they wrote the directions onto these two pillars, and a fellow by the name of Hermes or Harmine finds it after the flood, goes to the Great Pyramid, and so it's the one that floats that survives versus the one that was designed to survive by fire. And you wouldn't do it both pillars if you knew exactly which catastrophe was going to be coming. This is what 2 Peter 3 talks about, is this fire that's reserved for the end time, for the destruction, and the same fire that was there in the beginning between Genesis 1:1 and 2. So not a destruction of fire that came at the time, even though they were preparing for that as well. So the giants are the ones that are imposing this Nephilim world order that I would overlay on to the New World Order and just replace new with Nephilim world order, that had in the Atlantean version 10 kings over an empire that was trying to create a world government that had one universal Atlantean religion, which is the Zoroastrian or Enochian religion, and that they're doing this with angelic technology and through war. And so it's designed to stop this needless violence and destruction of the world, but not all of them are A, either wiped out, or B, didn't prevent other fallen angels from recreating giants after the flood. So when you get into the understanding that parent gods created giants before the flood, like Iapetus created Gog, Magog, and Albion, And then Zeus is creating Hercules, Perseus, Theseus, and other ones after the flood. And Zeus overthrows Kronos, which also created giants before the flood, and replaces him. Baal overthrows El in the Bible, both create giants in the accounts of the Ugaritic texts and Canaanite historical accounts that come down. Anki and Enlil overthrow Anu and Apsu and Tiamat and that whole pantheon of gods and create giants after the flood. We have to be open to the idea that these gods who inexplicably also disappear after the flood, shortly after, certainly after Babel, we don't see them walking amongst us anymore, would have had the same consequences that the parent gods had before the flood. And yes, they're described. So Baal, for example, in the Ugaritic text is described as being killed somehow. Well, again, how do you kill an immortal? Where they go from a biblical and a Gnostic perspective, and believe me, the Gnostics, even, they don't always like to admit some of their gospels, as in the gospel of Pistis of Sophia, actually shows the pit prison, showing these watcher angels and what they looked like within those pit prisons in another dimension, in another world. So the ones who created the giants, both before the flood and after the flood, went to the pit prison. Now, within the Epic of Gilgamesh, and I'll end on this, as I talked about, there's a second incursion after the flood that we get recorded with Enkidu and Gilgamesh through Ninsun and King Lugobanda for the Gilgamesh character. But there's also a flood story in there where Utnapishtim and all of his family are 2/3 God, 1/3 human, and offspring of the parent gods, and they're put on an ark to survive the flood. So even within that account, you have a second incursion and a survival story. So we have to be open to the idea that giants may have also survived the flood. So, and in the Greek account, Hesiod records the great giants were destroyed in the great wars before the flood, and then he also records the second creation of giants after the flood. So this again gets to be a standard throughout the world. So it was designed to give more of a restart, so all the names in the book of life could be fulfilled. But God, knowing that fallen angels who still have free will, even though he may be restricting what they can do as they violate more crimes against creation, as time moves forward, they're going to recreate the giants or help them or both to show up after the flood and any other creation that they may have created.
Do you take Noah's Ark literally, or is it possible that it was angel technology in some sort of spaceship?
Well, it would have to be very allegorical from a Genesis perspective to get out of the water into another dimension or into the sky. So from a literalist perspective, I would say no. From a polytheist perspective, in some of their accounts, they have angels that are, and people like Amakaseth, for example, in Gnosticism, who are in a cloud and protected in this cloud off the earth. You get other accounts where they were hidden in underground cities, in other dimensions, and lots of arcs around the world or on mountains. Polytheism has a lot of different ways where people and giants survive the flood. So I would include that as a possibility, that giants could have survived in spaceships off that, just because of the similarity of that in the cloud. And it's interesting, in the cloud, you also have the centaurs that are created in this cloud. And they have something more going on. There's more of a chimera effect with that type of being. And one wonders whether or not there's some sort of DNA sort of manipulation going on within that cloud, likely in a spaceship as we would understand that, or UAP today, to do experimentation to create that sort of race. Now, this technology that the angels would have been providing would have had DNA manipulation capability, which now answers the questions as to what's going on with these centaurs, what's going on with these chimera-like beings, like King Hababa of the Cedar Forest, for example. He's got multiple features of different animals on him. There's something more that's going on with that particular giant and his assignment to be the terrible one against humankind. And when Noah is calling 2 of unclean animals and 7 pairs of clean animals to the ark, the word is kind, which is a species. God is calling those animals. If I said Noah, sorry, it's God is calling those animals to the ark. There's a reason for that. It's because of this DNA capability to manipulate. So what the language says there is the whole earth was corrupted, not the water, just the earth, the land, and all flesh was corrupted. And that's the Hebrew word shakath, which means to pervert, to ruin, to decay, to destroy. And so that means the DNA was perverted. That means the plant genome was. And so God was calling what was pure, not manipulated, to restart as a representative of each species to cross the flood, which is why unicorns wouldn't have been called. This is not biblical. Because they were, as you look at what unicorns are in mythology and polytheist history, these are chimera beings that the giants wore, or not war, but rode into battle with. It was a war machine created through DNA manipulation. This is the level of technology we're just getting to today that was going on before the flood.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but I thought I heard you say on another podcast that the flood was caused by asteroids from the Pleiades. If that's true, can you expand on that?
Well, that's an account that is shown in many, many accounts around the world, and special temples and sites were set up to the Pleiades, the Seven Sisters. In Babel accounts after the flood, to honor these, to honor whatever the allegory you want to interpret from the Pleiades. So in that account, there's 2 or 3 of the sisters, because there's 7 sisters in the mythology, that come down as asteroids or stars or meteorites to be the ignition for the flood story. So you have them crashing into the oceans and the land, and it creates, in the Greek accounts of this, a conflagration of events. So you get flood, you get tidal waves, you get earthquakes, you get volcanoes, you get things flooding into the atmosphere, and it becomes a significant set of events. So if people are just looking for a flood story, then you can't recognize it because you're only looking for what the remnant of just the flood would be. And so if you have in the accounts in the Bible and you have the Pleiades that is connected to descriptions of this type of destruction with a set of flagration of events, with, like the sea or the floor of the oceans being exposed somehow, some way. I mean, we're talking about something significant, and the Pleiades are connected to that, as well as Orion, to this type of destruction that is talked about in the polytheist accounts. So in the Atlantis chapter in book 1, at the end of the Atlantis chapter, I give the Christians the passages where these passages do not fit anything after the flood. It only fits before the flood with the type of description and the data point references. And again, it's one of those sort of interesting sort of things, if you tag on to that, is you have a polytheist account seen through a polytheist lens recorded with that destruction, and a monotheist perspective through a monotheist lens within the Bible, using the same stars, the same beings. And there are other connections as well that will show up within the Bible as well, but I don't want to get too far down on the minutiae on that.
In the UFO world, it's common for people to talk about extraterrestrials being from the Pleiades.
Yeah.
In any of the scriptures you've read, do they talk about being from the Pleiades?
Well, so the other thing that the alien mythos talks about is coming from the stars and the star people, right? So the first thing that you can want to sort of get a connection on here is When we talk about star people biblically or star people in polytheism, we're talking about angels, fallen angels, because they're allegorically called stars and or planets, and they would be called wandering stars for the seven major gods. So they have a higher presence within the location of the earth. And so allegorically, a star is an angel, and it's called the host of heaven. And host is used interchangeably in the Old Testament with angels, with sons of God. Um, and so you get an understanding that this word host is the Hebrew word Saba, which means an army of angels or a rank. So stars, as they're even in the New Testament, stars, particularly in the book of Revelation, are referencing angels. And so if we understand these as a reference to the same type of being understood through different lenses, and let me just say biases, even though I have a biases to one of these particular ways of looking at it, the alien mythos recognize these as being stars, as in star people, just as a star represents each angel in polytheism and in monotheism, and that they're just not these godlike beings. They're highly advanced, have all of this knowledge, do the same things that the angels or the gods do in monotheism and polytheism, but yet they're not that high. They're not any different than we are, just more advanced. So there's a nuance in the understanding that's different. So do they come from the stars? Absolutely, no matter which point of view that you're going to look at. And it's why I encourage people to learn more, to decide what you believe, because it's carrying the same story. When the ancient alien mythos talks about ancient history, it's just substituting gods and angels for ancient aliens, right?
Yeah.
And a hierarchy of these aliens and a different hierarchical structure with capabilities. So it's the same story. It's just the lens. So do I watch Ancient Aliens? Absolutely, on the History Channel, because I'm looking at the details of what they're talking about in terms of the locations, the events, what happens.
Well, while we're talking about them, do you think that all these ancient structures built on the planet are from these gods?
Yeah, so you have a split in that in terms of a time frame as to when they're going to be built. So we have to sort of understand that. So you have uh, in polytheism, all the ancient cities were built by the gods, the really old ones with that technology. And so that would be aliens by the alien mythos, fallen angels by monotheist lands. And then with the creation of the Adamites, you have this expansion of knowledge that's going to be assisted by the fallen angels, by the aliens, by the gods, and they're going to develop another level of technology. So if we are talking something, let's say that is more than 5,000 years old, maybe 6,000 years old, that would likely be an angelic built product, or if it was built by humans to honor the gods with that technology, then it would have been in another epoch before Genesis 1, 2, between 1, 1 and 2, where you would have had a nice place for this angelic or God's rebellion, as it's recorded in polytheism, that destroyed the earth by fire, which is making more sense of that passage of 2 Peter 3 with this destruction by fire in the beginning that I had referenced. And that there's a renewal of the earth that's going on in days 1 through 6. And that's older than standard sort of secular chronology would have it, to have that technology in place. And it doesn't fit properly to just before the flood as well. So it doesn't mean that there isn't time to go, let's say, as far as 10,000 BC or so from a biblical understanding for creation of some of these cities. That would be younger than the ones from the the older ones that were in the other epoch. But before the technology would have been passed on to the humans. So somewhere around 3000 BC is when you start to see the full development, and maybe just before, say 3400 to 3000 BC using secular dating, where this knowledge is being applied by humans with the help of giants and with the help of the gods. And so how I get there sort of biblically on that, just sort of quickly, in 2 Peter 3, again, which is sort of a great template for prehistory, it has a day is like 1,000 years, and it's in reference to the beginning. And so if a day is 1,000 years and you have 6 days of creation, you have 6,000 years there. Then there's day 7 is 7,000 years for the Sabbath. And then we have no idea with when the Eden account happens, because there's no day 8 there. So you have room for an older period and still hold true to the genealogy of Adam, providing you recognize in Genesis 1 the details of that creation account of people in day 6 is not consistent with the details of the creation and with a special commission with the spirit being breathed into Adam, with the Adam and Eve creation account. That happens sometimes later. I have a document I send out for people if they want to walk through it, biblically taking it back to Hebrew to show you that it's not that Adam isn't part of the same species of day 6. It's just that the details are completely different.
Are you dating the Great Flood to about 4500 BC?
No, I wouldn't. But I wouldn't rule out a flood at that date, just not the Great Flood as it's understood in all accounts.
What date are you putting that at?
Well, I use 2 dates, but I can measure them up, but it takes a while to explain how dating was done on the secular side versus the biblical side. But so I understand there's the nuance there. And so the secular dating, as we get in terms as they use for how we understand timelines in history through the dynasties of kings in various cultures, they match those up, is 2950 to 3050, about 600 years different than the biblical chronology. So that would, if you understand what a lot of researchers have said, they've doubled up many of the dynasties to account for that 600 years different in the secular one, because kings would have up to 7 different names. So it'd be, and then you're multiplying that by all these other different cultures and kings. It's pretty easy to not quite get it right as you're dealing with that many years. So when I look at floods before that, I have no issues with floods before that. They're just not this worldwide cataclysmic flood that everybody talks about. So when Graham Hancock, which I admire his research, he has a Gnostic lens to his approach, which is fine. I understand it, but I love his research. And he talks about the Younger Dryas. He gets sort of civilization sort of starting at a great flood around 10,000, 10,500 BC, in that sort of range. Again, I don't have a problem with that, because I don't get locked into the standard dogma of how people read Genesis 1, 1, and 2 and conveniently overlook things that don't add up. And the only way you can make, if it's the word of God, it has to be perfect. You can't have contradictions. So, but all of a sudden, when you understand that there's 2 different creations going on, and just for one quick example for people out there is, you have male and female being created in day 6 in multiple numbers and told to migrate all around the world as nomads. And this is just the tip of the iceberg to the differences. Genesis 2, in the Eden account, Adam is created in singular. Sometime later, Eve is created. Adam is immediately put into Eden, and Eve is created because no suitable partner is found for him, whatever the heck that means, right? Which I won't go into right now. So right out of the gate, you have an agrarian society, because it's a garden, and it's Eden. It goes from the Nile to the Euphrates, from Mount Hermon to the Red Sea, Sea of Aqaba, that leads into the Indian Ocean, same land that Abraham is awarded in Genesis 15. and he's running orchards, he's running crops, he's got domesticated animals over a huge swath of land. And this is where the knowledge that the Gnostics talk about that Adam is provided to be able to do this. And then it starts to answer, well, now would understand that if Cain, after the Eden incident, was ostracized for killing Abel, he could go to Nod, east of Eden, on the other side of the Euphrates River, and find a wife because people were already living there. Otherwise, you get into other conflicts on how does the wife show up.
Biblically, I understand it that Noah's Ark landed in the mountains of Ararat. Would you say humanity started migrating around the world from the Ararat Valley?
Not start, because that would insinuate the original beginning, right? This would be a restart.
The restart, then, yeah.
Yeah, a replenish. It certainly very well could be. In the flood stories around the world, there is a specific holy mountain that is always sort of selected that the ark lands on. So you have the consistency of the story. From a monotheist perspective, we don't know exactly which mountain it was. We get what is accepted for the name coming downstream, but what the name of that mountain was before, we don't know, because the word Ararat means curse, as in the accursed oath that was named after with the Ham incident with Noah's wife, or with Noah, depending on how you want to interpret that, and the curse of Canaan. So that's the word Ararat that the mountain is named after. So it's kind of like Mount Hermon. Mount Hermon isn't the ancient name. In the Ugaritic text, it's called Saphon. It's called Nippur in the Sumerian accounts. It's called not only Hermon in the Bible, it's also called Shinir, Sirion, and Sion by other peoples. And Hermon is rooted in the Hebrew word haram, meaning curse or cursed, but this is an ecclesiastical, nuanced one, curse. And this is the root for harem anathema, that the oath the watchers took to carry out the creation of the giants, no matter what the consequences are. So that mountain was renamed biblically for what happened. It's kind of an MO that happens in the Bible, that some names aren't the original names, and it's more for to tell us more about what happened to that individual or those people. For example, you have a son of Japheth named Magog. That's probably not his original name. Why? Because Magog is the name of a giant that Albion created before the flood, and Magog is a popular name of giants and the Gyges kings along with Gog after the flood. So the implication is as they moved into the areas where the Scythian giants were located, the biblical to reflect that. So we get in historical accounts like with the Elamites, Olamim, as you take that back to the Hebrew, and these are Shemites that are named Elam, but that's not their original name either. And historians say there's two different groups of people that formed the Elamites. One was the Aboriginals, one was the Shemites that intermarried with them. And so the Olamim is one of the inexplicable giant races that show up early after the flood, either through second incursion or the survival. So when people leave Babel 100 years after the flood, they're going to migrate all around the world in the restart there, and they're going to go to where giants are already living. So that's where a lot of those names, and now you get a blending of the religion that was at Babel with the giant religion into a new sort of language of whatever the Babelites are going to be speaking, because they have a new confused language. And you have the original Indo-European or Indo-Aryan language of the giants, which is why we have so many Indo-Aryan words coming down in so many languages around the world, because that's part of that merging. And you can take a lot of the words that we get right back to the original Indo-European source word.
Was Atlantis basically a Nephilim community? And if
Yes.
so, where was it and what happened? Did it sink or blow up?
Well, it's destroyed by a conflagration of events from volcanoes, earthquakes, lightning, asteroids, and it is destroyed, likely sinks. I mean, you have possibly the earth crust that's shifting in this flood. The size of the cataclysm is so great, and that it was an island continent. And even the city had almost a Venice-like sort of look to it with all the uh, canals that were in there. And it probably, as with any most islands, even though it's might be closer to approaching a continent size, it would be not that far above sea level because it's just not big enough to get there. It might have a few mountains inwards, but also Atlantis, you have to also remember, which is why it gets confusing. And again, people don't take things into account when they're finding remnants or echoes of Atlantis in different locations. It was located in 10 separate locations. It was a 10 empire nation. So the central one was beyond the Pillars of Hercules. And I think Plato's pretty clear of that's in the Atlantic Ocean and probably closer to, well, I won't say closer to North America than Spain, but somewhere out there. Again, we get similar sort of findings just off of Spain and Portugal and closer into the Caribbean. But they were in North Africa. So people find things there. Well, of course, they'll have Atlantean architecture there. You're going to find a remnant. They were in Ireland and England, parts of Spain and Portugal, 10 different locations. I give the exact sort of layout as it's been recorded in book one. But understand that if you're trying to get to one specific site for all of it, you're not going to. But understand, if you're looking for that standard imagery of Atlantis, it's likely in the Atlantic Ocean.
You speak of 10 different empires, right, of antiquity. Do those 10 empires still exist today in other forms?
Not yet. From our limited understanding, not yet.
Not yet.
Not yet. And so let me sort of explain that. So in the end time, there will be 10 kings, just like it was before the flood. There'll be, and it's allegorized in prophetic allegory as 10 kings, 10 toes in Daniel 2, 10 horns in Daniel 7. So there will be an empire. That's the seventh beast empire. Now, Atlantis isn't considered part of one of the seven beast empires, but those are post-Diluvian beast empires. But it comes up out of the sea, kind of like Atlantis was sunk into the sea. And it's kind of a Hydra-like creature of these beast empires that comes up out of the sea, and it has the 10 kings. So it will be, as is nothing is new under the sun, it is like what happened in the past. And just as we saw beast empires like Egypt, Assyria, Persia, Medes, Greece, Rome, those are the first six after the flood that had considered world empires, but not literally because they're not all over the world. And they didn't bring an Antichrist type figure, although they may have been trying to do that. This seventh empire comes out of that, and those empires were ruled over by the Nephilim, Rephaim giant bloodlines. And so again, if we go back to what was before will be again, not only after the flood, but before the flood, and that Atlantis was ruled over by 10 Nephilim kings, shouldn't we expect something like that to be within this end time empire? And indeed, I think so. Yeah. So we should be prepared that giants might return. But even if they don't, we have a group of elites Elite, E-L, Elim in the pure sense before any dilution to the bloodline, Elim, who call themselves royal kings of God. And you can take the etymology back. I won't do that, but take my word for it. But if you think we want it on the record, I'll go through the etymology. Rex Deus in Latin, kings of God. And they keep their genealogies, even to this day, that goes back to a specific Nephilim or Rephaim patriarch and a specific fallen angel, god, or celestial mafia godfather, as I tongue-in-cheek like to talk about in this initiatory polytheist religion that they swear an oath to, that they receive the divine right to rule from the council of the gods that rules from Mount Hermon, both before and after the flood. And so, if you've heard of the Council of Gods before, sure, Lord of the Rings, that's actually the lower assembly of Detanu, as it's called in the Ugaritic texts of the kings, ruled over by the Baalim Council in the Ugaritic text. It's Nippur, where the Sumerian gods ruled from, that gave the divine authority to the Ring Lords, or the Lord of the Rings, right? It's this table, and it's been here throughout our history, both before and after. They keep these genealogies even to this day. So when you heard King Charles today, Prince Charles, when he said this, he said he takes his genealogy in part back to Vlad the Impaler, whom Dracula is based on, dragon patriarchal bloodline allegory of the bloodlines. Fairy is the matriarchal bloodline allegory of bloodlines in their literature, male and female. And Vlad the Impaler was this typical noble Celt, which is a Scythian, which is an Indo-Aryan. And in his persuasion, he had red hair, hazel eyes, pale skin, just as the Atlantean giants were red-haired, blonde-haired, blue-eyed, and hazel-eyed, and pale skinned. And he took his bloodlines. Vlad the Impaler also kept his bloodlines that go back to the Agrathi tribe of Scythia, which was started by Hercules, which is the offspring of Zeus and Alcmene, part of the Herculean Gyges kings that we talked about. And noting that Gyges, as we pronounce it, or Gyes in the plural, is a Greek word for giant. Gigas is Gygus, is the original Greek for giant, and gigantes or giantes. And giant comes from giantes, which Gygus is the root word for the original giantes in Greek. And that if there's an E or an I after the G, it's a Y sound for the plural. And if it's an A and a couple other vowels, it's a hard sound. So that's how the singular and the plural was formed. So they have these genealogies. That's just one example. And he would have, and Vlad the Impaler would be part of what they call the Creta gens from Zeus. Zeus was associated with Crete. Original Semitic for Crete is KRT, Creta, as we would have it transliterated. LB gens is the major gens in the Windsor bloodline from Odin.
What about Putin or President Xi?
Well, yeah, it's a great question. So Putin believes he has a genealogy back through the Romanovs, back to the Putyanin of Kiev, which were the original Scythians and Tsars. These are giants, Indo-Aryans, and mostly blonde hair, blue-eyed ones in that region. And that in 1000 AD, the Putyanin set up a branch location, a junior offshoot kingdom at Moscow. And that is Vladimir the Great that Putin idolizes with statues in Moscow. And that in the 1600s, there wasn't a male heir, so the female married and took a different name, but another Putyanin bloodline of the Romanovs, a junior offshoot, took over. So when Putin is talking to Tucker, he's saying all he wants to do is put together the Romanov dynasty. What do you think he's actually talking about? And the Putyanin royals if you had offspring outside the marriage, you would not receive the natural inheritance and you would not receive the wealth and the full name, but you wouldn't live in poverty. So they would give them part of the name. Putin's grandfather is the farthest, and some people say great grandfather, but whichever. You cannot trace the Putin name beyond his grandfather or great grandfather, who was born in Kiev. And then his father moved to St. Petersburg just before World War I, which is how he arrives in Russia and then rises to power. So he believes, at least his mythos, whether it's true or not, he's utilizing that he has a divine right to rule as part of perhaps one of these 10 kings of the end time as a Putianin. And so when we look at that word Moscow, it has an etymological root to a word called Meshach that comes out of early post-Diluvian history. And Meshach is associated with the Scythians and the giants, the Indo-Aryans. And there's a great war after the 10 kings come to power in the Bible called the Gog-Magog War in Ezekiel 38 and 39. It happens in the end time in the last 7 years. And it says Gog, Magog, Gog of Magog, chief prince of Meshech. So Gog does not have a patriarch. We get Magog, as I mentioned earlier. Gog shows up inexplicably as an antichrist-like figure in the end time, as it's defined in a foreign word. And Gog was the offspring of, originally before the flood, Iapetus, just as Magog was, but giants were named after the flood, after giants before the flood. Another example, just so people know what I'm talking about, Gilgamesh, who I talked about earlier, 6th generation after the flood. But yet we have a giant in the Enoch Book of Giants named Gilgamesh before the flood. So, but we get a birth of Gilgamesh after the flood, 6 generations after the flood. So 2 different giants. It's that mythos and legacy follows through the Zoroastrian religion after the flood. So they name giants after the flood on ones that were named before the flood. So Gog is something that just shows up out of nowhere in the Bible that's related to a giant. And Meshech is the etymological root for the city of Moscow.
It sounds like to me, from what you're saying, that Putin would think he has a divine right to Kiev, since that's where he's from.
Yes. So he doesn't want to destroy Kiev, but he will not stop until he gets it. So if we want to understand the geopolitics, we have to understand the royales all believe they're a superior race through genealogy, through education, through position, and that they are a rival to rule the world. Just, I don't know if people are familiar with the old Highlander shows, movies and TV series. There can only be one, and to kill one of them, you have to take the head, which is how you kill a giant, is you take the head, right? And so that's what's going on. It's a Game of Thrones. You know, World War I was a war of inter-family war. They were all first cousins because they intermarry to keep those bloodlines pure. They were all on first name visiting basis before the war breaks out. You want to understand geopolitical politics around the world, you have to understand the royals and the bloodlines and the elite that dominate the top 2 classes and have all throughout our history. So how does that fit with Xi? Well, similar to the Romanovs, the Western European bloodlines created what I would call a political virus called left-wing politics and communism, National Socialism and socialism and anarchism. All of those would be sort of part of that social masonry that they called it. And so they launched that on Russia through Trotsky and Lenin, and that took down the most purest rival bloodline that they weren't getting along with. And the Romanov dynasty was all but wiped out. And they continued with National Socialism to get communism out of control, and all of a sudden you're missing the Kaiser dynasty out of Germany. And then you had this war just before World War II in Spain where the Bourbon family temporarily is knocked out. And then they launched the communists, and there's communists involved in that war as well. And then they launched on China that takes down the Shah dynasty, XIA. And the Shah dynasty goes back into prehistory, both before and after the flood, both times created by the dragon creator gods. Common allegory in terms of the gods, but I'll just finish with this to finish up with Xi. So as these Chinese dynasties come through and they're populating the Southeast Asia kingdoms with descendants of the Shah dynasty throughout history, you have two divisions of this branch. You have an Eastern bloodline and a Western bloodline. One is XIA, one is XI. Xi, XI, comes from the Western bloodline of the Shah dynasty from the dragon creator gods. Now, a seraphim angel, which created most of the pantheons of the fallen angels and most of the giants, not all, but most, at least what we have a record of, they were six-winged, serpent-faced heavenly dragons. So when you see serpent imagery all around the world with the gods, whether it's the feathered serpent and the plumed serpent out of Central and South America and the Popol Vuh, whether or not it's the Uraeus gods like Baal, El, Osiris, Ra, whether original gods in Greek like Zeus and Kronos, whether or not as Enlil, Enki, Tiamat, Apsu, Anu, they're all depicted as serpentine gods. That's no coincidence.
Many people believe we're in the end times. And from what you're saying, since we don't have the 10 empires, we're not in them. Would you agree?
Well, you have to be sort of careful on qualifying what end time means to people. And so, and it is true, we do not have the 10 kings yet. We do not. So that part we need to factor in as well. As it comes down in polytheist prophecy, it's the age of Aquarius. Now, that's a very big age of over 2,000 years, but sometime early in the age of Aquarius, you get this destruction by fire that we were talking about. So again, a constant, just different outcomes through the different lenses that you're looking through it from a religious sort of perspective as to what comes next. And so biblically, though, it's more than just the last 7 years that Daniel 9:27 says is the end time, Ketz. And within there's the last 3.5 years, which is Moed Ketz, which is the appointed end time. So Jesus, when he presented his template and chronology of the end time, gave a very specific set of events when all of those events would take place and his second coming would come within that. But he framed it within a generation called the fig tree generation. So now it's a little bit more than just the last 3.5 years or the last 7 years or the last 10 years. There's a generation. Biblically, we're not given a clear number on this generation because we can go 40 years as a generation in the desert in the Exodus. We can go 70 and 80 years as used for a generation of a king in the Psalms, or at least a generation in those accounts. And then life was limited to the giants in Genesis 6:3 in the creation of the giants to 120 years. All life was. So we don't know what the start of the fig tree generation is. And then we have 40 to 120 years where those events could happen in. What we do know is this, is that in prophetic allegory, we can go into detail on how I get there, but just for the premise, the fig tree generation refers as prophetic allegory as they're defined in the Old Testament to the southern kingdom of Israel, which we would understand as Jewish people today, versus the northern kingdom that was dispersed and lost into history. And we haven't seen them reawaken yet. So again, we're not in those final years yet because we haven't seen Israel awaken yet. But the fig tree is when it is back in bloom into the covenant land. And more specifically, Jerusalem is the epicenter. So it has to be, it's part of all biblical sort of end time prophecy. So the Southern Kingdom is in the covenant land, and they took Jerusalem in 1967. So I think 1967 might be a possible start date versus 1947 with the Declaration of Independence and 1948, the War of Independence for Israel, because everything centers around Jerusalem. So, and Jesus killed the fig tree that bore no fruit just before he was crucified as a curse because they're about to reject their Messiah. And the disciples knew what he was referring to. And that's why they wanted to know what the signs of the end time were, is that they're, and the destruction of the temple and the city. And so I think we are in the fig tree generation, but we're a ways away from the last 10 years or the last 7 years. There's just too many things on the geopolitical settings that have to come together first. So it will take catastrophes. Where we would be in what Jesus said were the birthing sorrows, the calamities that would precede it: pestilence, pandemic, earthquakes, and wars and rumors of wars. And I think that, along with the false prophets predicting global apocalypse and doom and catastrophes getting worse, is how that progresses throughout. That will bring about the scenario for the universal religion of old, Zoroastrianism, Enochian mysticism, the daughters of Babylon, as we would know it biblically, that forms into the mother religion, the mother of harlots, as she's called in prophetic allegory, and the 10 king government. And also, that has to be in place to start the last 7 years. And also, you have to have a universal religion in place, because the Antichrist, who won't be Antichrist at this point because he's crowned at the midpoint of the last 7 years, is going to negotiate this 7-year covenant. And within the first 3.5 years of that last 7, the southern kingdom of Judah will be permitted to begin their sacrifices on a wing or an overspreading of the temple. You cannot imagine that taking place with Islam as a universal religion, or unless Islam is brought to heel under a larger religion and enforce that they would be able to build a wing onto the current temple to the location of the Holy of Holies to present start doing the daily sacrifices. Notwithstanding, the Jewish people believe they're very close, because they're already starting to do red heifer sacrificial sacrifices in preparation for the anointing of where they would do the sacrifices in the temple, as is predicted in Daniel 9:27. And you need that for the entrance of their Messiah in the preparation to cleanse it. That's the red heifer sacrifice.
You're speaking of one universal religion. Maybe AI will create this one universal religion.
It's going to be part of it. We'll see how big of part that AI would be in terms of the end time religion. But why and how do I get there? A couple of pieces have to come together here, and that we're talking about angelic technology that was before. That is angelic technology. And that as they're writing AI and they write algorithms that guide the AI in the background that nobody sees, these are invisible algorithms. And the jargon for it is daemon algorithms, the Greek word for demon. So they name everything after what they're doing. You just have to sort of open up your eyes, and they've dumbed us down not to recognize these types of things. But this angelic technology is going to need to be in place to be like the end times. And if we look at Gnosticism, which is the easiest one, which is an extension out of Zoroastrianism, Gnosis means knowledge. Gnosticism is a knowledge religion. All polytheism is a knowledge religion, where they keep the secret knowledge reserved and away from the mundane. And that this knowledge has the ability to destroy the earth by fire, by the way, that they say that they have. whether they've had it all throughout our history or not, but they're secreting whatever knowledge that they have. So even when, the word wisdom in Greek is Sophia. Sophia was the mother goddess that created the 12 archons in Gnosticism. Sophia is a name that's also used in AI. If we understand that the knowledge is, the religion of polytheism is a knowledge religion, then that says AI is probably an extension out of that. Now, chicken and egg, which will do what first for the end time religion, but expect it to be part of it. And so AI is going to be part of two systems, and we'll see it at lower levels as what we're seeing it today. We're seeing the development age. AI is going to be eventually part of the beast system of Antichrist and the mark, but at a different level than what we see today, because it's still developing. And Babylon, which comes in as the universal religion that Antichrist will replace, because he destroys Babylon at the midpoint of the last 7 years when he comes to power and puts in his own religion. Babylon probably puts most of that AI together in its system when it controls all of the world economics, and grows rich from it, along with the 10 kings. But I think Antichrist will take it to an additional level.
When you say the beast system, are you referring to potentially us, humanity,
No.
getting chipped?
Yes, that would be part of that. So if you're going to create godhood in the physical world, and I think that's going to be the promise of not only the universal religion, but then the religion of Antichrist, so that we can evolve, do a harmonic convergence, vibrate into godhood to how the original giants originally had, both in the body and in the spirit. Then you have to offer that if you're going to want to swear a loyalty to these intelligent beings that are going to be walking amongst us again, whether or not they show themselves as aliens, as part of the demonic class. And maybe I should come back to demonic later to explain a biblical perspective on that, as to some of these different groups of people. But you're going to require an explanation for these beings that are going to be walking amongst us, just as it was in the days of Noah before the flood and shortly after the flood. And so when we look at what needs to be sort of put into place for the end time, you're going to have this technology that continues to be provided for us, that's going to be able to tap into multiple dimensions. So quantum computing is still being developed. You are going to need AI to search in multiple locations in one dimension at a time, or in multiple dimensions in multiple locations in those dimensions at any one time, to be effective. One of the things that they're wanting to find in all dimensions is something they call the divine essence in the new age. It would be called the Brahman or the Atma or Atman particle in the Vedas and Upanishads. And it is understood as being this invisible particle that you can't measure, versus in the quantum level, a particle you could somehow measure or detect, but this one you cannot. It merges with the one that you can measure, and it holds all of the knowledge of all the different dimensions that is transmitted through quantum entanglement instantaneously. You need to tap into that to give you the wisdom to be like a god, the knowledge, because gods are all knowing. And you also need immortality. So they're going to have clone technology or sleeve technology or replacement parts or transhumanism or whatever the technology is going to be to create this oiketerion, the soul and a body that is immortal and can have unlimited knowledge, except that a human spirit goes to sleep and back to heaven, waiting for whichever resurrection you're going to have from a Christian perspective. From a royale perspective, their bodies don't go to sleep. And because they receive the counterfeit spirit of the gods, they're not permitted to go to heaven, and they're not permitted to go to sleep. So they're going to do a couple of things. One, if they get their rituals and knowledge right, they'll be able to find their way into Hades or Sheol, where their gods dwell, and to be with the gods, the ones that aren't in the pit prison, because not all of them are there. Just the ones who did the worst violations are in the pit prison. And or if they're not able to get there, they're going to wander the earth as demon spirits. And the worst of the ones, biblically, called the terrible ones, who did terrible things to humankind while they were on the earth, just as King Hababa is called the terrible one to do terrible things to humans, as the king of the cedar forest in the Epic of Gilgamesh text. These ones are in the sides of the pit prison, where you have in Ezekiel 32 that description. They're talking to a pharaoh from there in this really interesting and prophecy, and also the strong ones are there, El, which are the fallen angels, and these are the ones that are going to come out in Revelation 9 in the last 7 years, just before the Gog War. And the Gog War is the 200 million man war in Joel 1 and 2, just to sort of get the time frame on that. So looking at that system that has to be in place, getting back to the AI and back on track to the question, that's going to be put in place by Babylon. And then Antichrist is going to take that over. Now, it's important to understand that these disembodied spirits are demon spirits. They're not angelic spirits. And there's a different level in the hierarchy of the visible ones, even though not all of them have bodies. But even for the ones that are coming up out of the pit prison, they're going to need bodies if they're going to interact in the end time. So these Oikatarians are going to be dwelling places for the spirit for the disembodied spirits, because the humans are still asleep. And so one of the words for giant in the Old Testament and after the flood is Rephaim, as in Rephaim giants in Genesis 14 and the War of Giants, and Genesis 15 as part of the land, means giant. Nephilim's only used 3 times in the Old Testament. Rephaim is used like 25 times, and Nephilim is associated with giants before the flood. Rephaim are associated after the flood, and are the ones that Baal and Nat and the Baalim Council are said to have created in the Ugaritic text after the flood. So that word Rapha is the singular, Raphaim is the plural. Rapha has several different words coming out of that. Rapha means to heal, just as the giants had the ability to heal themselves and others. So that's why you had to kill them with the sword. I'll just finish quickly on this. And so it has an extension word, 7496 from 7495, which is Rapha, which means a demon spirit or an evil spirit. It's the disembodied spirit or the demon spirit of what's going on with the giants and their counterfeit spirits. And 7497 is giant. There's another word called teraphim that is produced. Teraphim is a talking idol, and its source word in Rapha. So it's a demonic talking angelic technology Oikatarian that was used in the Old Testament. We get it in several locations, not always translated as teraphim, but just as idol or a talking idol, but sometimes translated as teraphim in the KJV. So this is like a family idol that people would speak to, and it would speak back to them, and they would think it would be their descendants, but it's actually just demonic spirits. And so biblically, for Christians that would be out there, you connect this back in, because when Jesus was eliminating evil spirits, unclean spirits, and devil spirits, and depossessing those people, those are two of those are correct in terms of the description. One is a poor translation. Devil is a poor translation. Typically, devil goes back to Greek as diabolos and used for the devil in the Bible, as in Satan, as in when he's called a devil. This word is daemon. Possession is done by demons. Avatara effect is angelic. There's nuances similar, but they're nuanced in how those are approached. So I think there's going to be demons that are part of this AI system that is going to be working from a Indo-Aryan giant Nephilim religious system, which was Enochian mysticism, Zoroastrianism, that was both before and after the flood and the coming universal religion. So yes, a connection there.
Gary, due to time, I need to switch gears with you. If people want to find out more about your books, where do they go?
Yeah, so if you're interested in what I'm saying or want to learn more about it, the best way to go is to go to my website, the Genesis6conspiracy.com. That's Genesis 6, the number 6conspiracy.com. On that website, generous excerpt of all 84 chapters of book 1 and all 98 chapters of book 1, all 84 chapters of book 2. If you are not familiar with the Bible, start with book 1. If you're really familiar with the Bible, go to book 2, and then you want to go back to book 1 anyways because of some of the other things you want to learn about, and that I'll reference. If you want to get a hold of me, there's a contact the author icon on the website. I'm running about 3 months behind, so on answering emails, so do be patient. I will get back to you. If you want to get a copy of my book and support me, you can go to the Buy Now page and get a signed copy. If you want to get one of each, go to buy page 3. That's where you get the discount for bundling. The other ones have discounts, but they're for the individual books. But if you make the mistake, send me an email. I do look at all the emails coming in for purchases. And if you say, hey, I bought 2 of book 1, but I wanted one of each, that's fine. Just let me know and I'll send you one of each. And if you want to go to Amazon.com, Amazon.ca, BarnesandNoble.com. I have links over to those sites. If you want to get the digital version, I have links over to the Kindle on Amazon. If you want the Audible versions, there's direct links right over to Amazon Audible for the books as well.
Are you working on a part 3?
I am.
Great.
And also a Da Vinci Light Code novel that I'm not doing the writing on. I'm just doing the review and giving the information for the background on secret societies, ancient bloodlines, end time prophecy. So it's kind of like a Da Vinci Code type of novel on the early part of the end time. And although the characters are fictional and the story is the fiction, a lot of the information is realistic. It's kind of I wouldn't classify it in mythopoetic in terms of some of the quality of some of those writers, but it's kind of in that kind of style as well.
Before we finish up, can you leave us with a last positive message?
Yeah, we can. And I think, first of all, I want to just cover off the elementals in terms of what's in the Bible. Elemental in the Bible shows up in Galatians 4 and also in Colossians as it's translated as rudiments. It's the Greek word stoichion. And these are those who enslave us in the earth. Elemental sounds familiar. It's the basic element in the world, and in the occult, it's associated with like earth, wind, fire, air. And there's 4 groups of elementals that are created by the gods. In those 3 grouping, that grouping of the 4, there's 2 groups. There's 3 little groups of 3, and there's a larger group of reptilian salamanders that live underground and are larger than humans. The 3 little ones and these 4 groups are constant all around the world in polytheist religions. The 3 groups of little ones are good-looking ones like pixies, mischievous ones like leprechauns, and then ugly ones like trolls. Within the ugly ones, you have a group called the gnomes, and every group, and there's multiple groups in each, has a specific assignment in prehistory and early post-Diluvian history for the demigods, the giants. And the gnomes looked after technology, genealogies, and knowledge. And these are little ones that have their own UAPs. They come through portals, and they're called fairy domens. Domen means portal. It's like a Stonehenge type of thing. And they are called the gray gnomes, the gray fairies. And they're described identical to gray aliens. But two of those accounts in book one, and if you didn't know it was a fairy abduction, you'd swear it was a gray alien abduction. This is all part of the hierarchy. They're interdimensional travelers, just as a lot of the UFO mythos has them coming through portals, whether it's in the oceans. Um, I put a lot of this allegory and information to understand the language into book one, but understand that biblically we get elementals as part of the visible hierarchy, answering to the invisible hierarchy of the Council of the Gods in the Bible. So again, a standard understanding. It's just what is the lens that it's going to be delivered through and understood through when we see more of them. What's the positive news? Positive news is there's more and more information that is coming out, unlike any other time in the world. And that no matter which point of view that you are part of, change is coming. It's just what type of change and how are you going to believe it? So you have, for the first time in our history, and maybe since before the flood, when the knowledge is similar to what we have to today, you have access to make your own decision. And the positive thing is be comfortable in what you believe in. And not making a decision is a decision. So learn enough and then be comfortable with it. And that's the best we can do. I have my own biases. I'm not trying to convert everybody to Christianity. I'm trying to get information in people's hands to make their own decisions.
Gary, thank you for your message, and I hope our paths will cross again.
Thank you.
Thanks for watching the JeffMara podcast. I really appreciate you. Another way to show support is through YouTube memberships. And if you do, there are loyalty badges and other perks depending on your level of membership. All you need to do is click the join button underneath the video to find out more. Thank you for your support.